I grew up in Sparks, Nevada, which is just east of Reno, and my father was working for the Southern Pacific Railroad at the time. And I remember him leaving through the back door, and I was outside playing, and he walked through the alley, picked up the neighbor, and they walked to work. And within hours, I guess, he came home, and I thought, gee, that's unusual for Dad to be coming home. And he walked in the house, and I could hear a lot of loud voices. And he told my mother, I've been fired. And she says, why? And he says, because Japan is at war with the United States. And she says, well, what are you going to do? And he says, well, we have to think this out. Eventually, he could not get a job because he was Japanese in a white community. I think there was only one other Japanese family in Sparks. And I remember Tom telling me that he did not live with the curfew or the restrictions. And I asked him how he got away with it. And he says, I told everybody I was Chinese. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But because Dad was fired, my oldest brother was a senior in high school. And he had to work in the evenings after school in the grocery stores, stocking shelves. Because if he worked during the day, the people would see so-called Jap at that time, and they didn't want to shop in a store that hired a Jap. So he went in after the stores closed and stocked all the shelves. Then he took the back roads and he drove home because we had a curfew of 5 p.m. that we had to be in the house. We could not even be outside in our front or backyard. So he broke curfew and went to work and took the back roads home. My oldest sister was a junior in high school, and she was going to cosmetology school. And when she finished, they granted her her license at the age of 17 because they said she was mature for her age, and it was a hardship case. So they gave her a license at 17, and she started working at the Arcade Beauty Salon in Reno after school until midnight, because the dealers would come in and have their hair done after 4 o'clock in the evenings. So she had a taxi meet her in the alley, and she would crawl into the taxi and sit on the floor of the back seat so they wouldn't see her. Then he'd drive her home. And our house was located on a block where there was an alley, and so he could drive from the front yard through to the alley and leave. So he would dump my sister off at the back door as she would come in, and the taxi would leave. And this was something he did every night for her, so she wouldn't be arrested for breaking curfew. Every night I was writing to ORA, Office of Redress Administration, or the Department of Justice, which we refer to as DOJ, and they would say, well, you're a unique case, so we can consider your case because it's not a case of being interned. So we all thought, oh, this is a piece of cake. We'll fill out these papers and we'll get our reparations and an apology, and we'll be on our way. Well, it wasn't that simple. It was an 8.5-year battle with Department of Justice and the Office of Redress Administration. And every time we sent in our stories, they would write us back and say, well, you have to have this qualification. So we would find the paperwork to get that qualification. And then they finally came back and said, being fired from the railroad, it was not a government firing, so we can't give you redress. The Southern Pacific Railroad companies, all the railroad companies fired their workers. And we knew that wasn't true because it was an FBI firing. And the FBI was running all over Reno and Sparks. They came to our house and they searched our house without a warrant. And I guess you can do this under the Enemy Alien Act. And I said, well, you know, I told ORA I was a citizen and you searched my bedroom without a permit. And they said, well, we can do that because it was your father's house. And of course, we lost all our individual rights and everything else when the war broke out and they interned all the Japanese. My aunt and uncle had lived in Reno. They came out when my dad was working for the railroad. He got his brother a job. So when he got married, they lived in Reno for some years, then they moved to Sacramento. During the war, my uncle was also fired from the railroad, and he was sick the day of the firing, but it was an FBI order to be fired on this February 19th. 1942, and he didn't show up for work. So the boss from the following shift went to the house, and my aunt was with my uncle, and they fired him in his sickbed. So the day after the war ended, the day the war ended, my father's boss came to the house and asked him to come back to work the following day. It was the best news he could have had. But at the time he was fired, his boss was also a personal friend, and he told us at my dad's funeral the hardest thing he ever had to do was fire my mother. I fired my father. And so during this time, the boss was also an assemblyman for the state of Nevada. So he went to the governor of Nevada and asked him, please spare this man his job, because he had a wife and 5 children in the family. And he would personally swear to the security of my father working there. And he said he couldn't do anything about it. It was out of his hands because it was a presidential order. So I looked for these papers. Mitchie Wiglin had contacted me, and we both wrote a lot of articles for the different newspapers. And she told me to go to the archives and see if I could find some kind of memo as far as the conversation between my father's boss and the governor. And of course, I went to Carson City and I went through all the paperwork, and we couldn't find anything. I think we spent 3 different weekends in Carson, and then we went to University of Nevada, Reno, and they had the archives there, so we searched the files there, and we couldn't find anything. But in Carson, when I was working, the person in charge was a son of one of my professors in college. So he took a personal interest in the case to help me. And he called me and told me that somebody had gone to a convention or something, and Andy Russell had spoken on railroad workers. So he gave me the phone number to contact Andy Russell. I called Andy, and it was his wife's phone number, and Andy and his wife had separated. So the wife called Andy to give him my message and my phone number. And then while I was searching the archives in Reno, Andy called my home. And so my son, when I came home, my son came running out of the garage and said, Andy Russell called you tonight. And I says, Howard, it's 11:30. I can't return the call. So I made an effort to call Andy the next day. And I says, Andy, I found your master's thesis at the University of Nevada archives, and I read it, and you have the information that I need for our reparations. He had a letter from Ely, Nevada, in their mining. The attorney for the mining company had written the president and said, went to a meeting, and the FBI was present, and he named one of the FBI agents. And of course, the FBI did not leave a paper trail, but the agent had told them to fire all the railroad workers working in the mines, because they didn't want, and they wanted to fire the mine workers also. They didn't want the mine workers working in the mine with dynamite, because the white population were afraid of having the Japanese working in the mine with dynamite. And they also fired the railroad workers because they had the little railroad cars delivering the ore to their destination. So I asked him, you made mention of these letters. I said, do you have copies of it that I could have? And he said, yes. So he sent me all the papers, and I sent those to well, I called the Office of Redress Administration and told them what I had, and they couldn't believe it, because they said this is the first time they've heard of anything like that. And they ordered all the Japanese to be fired. The Italians and Germans were also to be fired. But after 10 days, they said if they did not swear allegiance to another country, they could hire the Italians and the Germans back, but not the Japanese. And the Italian and German citizens were not fired, but the Japanese citizens were also fired. And in the archives, I was reading in the Nevada newspapers that the governor of Nevada, with a few other governors, were trying to take away the citizenship of the Japanese people. He said, just because they were born here does not mean that we have to give them citizenship. So they were going to try to get an amendment to not have any citizens of Japanese in America. But the time was running out, and because the timing of the effort, they weren't able to produce that. But the newspapers in Nevada have that all published. And so I found that in the files. And so Office of Redress said if there's anything that happened to the Germans and the Italians, the Japanese could not qualify. But because the Italians and Germans were able to go back to work and the Japanese were not, I felt that I had a pretty strong case going. So I pursued it some more, and they asked me if I would bring these papers to a meeting that we were having in San Francisco with the Office of Redress Administration. Meanwhile, the day before, they had one in Los Angeles, and I sent my nephew to go there to find out what to do. And they told him at that time, do not use the railroad because you cannot get reparations as a railroad family, but to find some other way of getting your redress. And he says that my auntie doesn't think so. So they came to San Francisco and they said, you must be the auntie. And I says, yes, I am. And I says, I found these papers and I will turn them over to you if you can promise me that you will, it was made out to Nevada Railway. And if you will apply that to all railroads, I will turn over the paper and make the reparations for also the family members, not just the person who was fired. And they said, Fumie, at this late date, I think we have to give it to the families. And it won't be just for Nevada Railway, it will be for all railroads. So I met with them in San Francisco. And we were sitting there talking, and they said, I hope you have the papers that will make me happy all the way back to Washington, D.C. And I says, I think I do. But I also want to state at this meeting that I love this country. There isn't any other country I'd like to live in. But going to work, I saw a license plate frame in front of me, stopped at the signal light, and it said, I love my government. I love my country, I don't trust my government. And I says, this was on a white man's car. I says, do you know how the Asians feel? I says, I also love this country, but I fear my government after what you've done to my family. Well, my sister backed away from me, my brother-in-law backed away, my husband backed away, my girlfriend backed away, and I was sitting in this row by myself. And I thought, gosh, if you guys would just speak up, because I need the support. But no one would speak up because they were afraid of reparations. But then they took the papers back and met with them. I found out later that Mrs. Kaneko, another railroad worker who was living in Nevada, they were fired in Utah and they moved to Nevada after they retired, had a lawsuit going, suing the government. And they said if she won her case, they wouldn't have to bother with mine because we would all get reparations. She filed 2 lawsuits and she lost both of them. So then it was up to me to get the paperwork going to see if we can win. Evidently, her attorney had also filed the same papers that I had, but the Department of Justice said they have never seen these papers before. So evidently, it was not a strong case in court when he presented the paperwork. But I presented the paperwork, and they told me, Kenji Taguma from the Nichibei Times had done a New Year's story on me for the New Year's edition, and it was a little-known story. And he gave my side and my family side to in the newspaper, and then he interviewed Andy Russell, and he interviewed Department of Justice and ORA. And ORA at that time said the papers were not relevant enough, that they couldn't use it. And I was so upset when I read that story. Somebody else had written Nichibei a letter to the editor and said what a fine article it was. And so I pulled out my little typewriter because I'm not that well with the computers. But I used my electric typewriter and I started pounding away and I was crying and I was typing. And I says, well, you know what? I says, we have been given the runaround for 8.5 years. And it was all picky little things. They were throwing roadblocks at us all the time. They were encouraging us, and then they'd turn us down. So I says, I hope I don't hurt the reparations for the other workers, but I've got to say my piece. So I typed up a half-page article in the Nichibei newspaper, and I sent it to Rafu Shimbun in Los Angeles, and I sent it to Pacific Citizen. But Kenji printed the letter in his newspaper. And I also made reference to Dee Dee Green's comments and Joan Chietti's comments in the newspaper. And I guess I made a lot of waves because I told them everything they had done to us, everything I didn't like, everything I didn't think was fair. And they called me back. They called me on the phone. And I didn't realize I was going to Washington, D.C. with members of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations from Los Angeles. And we were going to meet with Bill Landley and the Office of Redress. My name was on that list, and I didn't know it had been presented. So they called me at work, and a little office girl came in and said, you have a phone call, but they'll wait for you until you dismiss your class for lunch. So I went to the office thinking it was a parent that was calling me about something. And when I found out it was the Office of Redress, and I had written in there that Dee Dee Green had promised to return my call, and she never returned it. So she called me and she says, I didn't realize I had told you that. So she says, I want to apologize. And she says, I want you to know I've been trying to help the railroad workers get redress. And I says, Dee Dee, I believed you at first. I really felt that you were trying to help us. But eventually you started throwing all these roadblocks at us, and it wasn't any help at all. And I've got letters that I'm going to give you when I reach Washington where I felt you were trying to help us. But I says, at this point, I don't think you're helping us at all. I said, you're doing everything to keep us from getting redress. And so we aired a lot of things out. My principal walked in on the conversation, and he was just astonished at the way I was talking to somebody. He thought it was a parent, so he stood there and listened to my conversation. And after I hung up, he said, wow, who was that? And I said, it was the Office of Redress Administration. So my knees were shaking, but I said, I sure feel a lot better because I got 8.5 years of frustration off my chest in that one phone call. Yeah, we went to Washington, and we met in the office, and Dee Dee Green was sitting across the table from me with Joanne Chietti. And Bill Landley walked in, and he was sitting at the head of the table. I was sitting next to him. My attorney was sitting next to me. And Dee Dee and I were having this conversation, and I was giving her all the paperwork that I felt that she was helping us. But then I gave her the paperwork also showing where she was not helping us. And Bill Landley was just rifling through his paperwork, and I didn't think he was paying attention. He heard every word we said. After we presented our case, there was another girl, Amy Matsura, from Denver, Colorado, who also was there to speak for railroad workers. So she gave her family story, and I gave mine. There was a man who was fired because he was a section worker, and they were repairing the railroad tracks. Evidently, the way he was taught to repair them was different than the way most railroads fix their tracks. And he was pulling out the stakes to lay new railroad tracks. Well, there was a military train that was due to come through, and they thought he was trying to sabotage the tracks when he was repairing it. So they fired him immediately. And he moved to this boarding house where they let a lot of Japanese, it was owned by a Japanese family, and they let Japanese families who were fired and didn't have money come and live there free. And Amy was there with this man, and we all knew the story of how he was fired for pulling out the railroad stakes, but no one knew that he committed suicide. He hung himself in this boarding house, and Amy was living there at the time. So I says, Amy, you've got to tell this story because we all know he was fired, but we don't know what happened from there. So she told that story, and they just gasped. They could not believe that he had hung himself over the firing. He felt that what he did was a cause for all railroad workers to be fired. So he took it personally. And in Japan, you commit suicide to save your pride. And that's what he had done. So when Amy told that, that was really the highlight of our meeting. But then I told my story also, and I had a picture of my father that I brought, and I put it on the table, and I says, does this man look like a threat to the United States? I says, the only crime he committed was because he looked like the enemy, and he was fired for that one reason. They told us later they would come to a decision. And I told them that in 1942, we did not have any leaders in the country. I says the FBI director, the President of the United States, the military were not good leaders at all. And they made very poor decisions. So later on, 10 days later, Bill Lanley decided that he would have a press conference in Los Angeles. Well, I had just gotten home from Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. On Saturday and Sunday, I went to Los Angeles for the time of Remembrance because they were going to honor Mitchie Wiglin. And Mitchie had helped the railroad workers all along by writing letters and encouraging us and pushing us. When we were giving up, she wouldn't let us give up. She kept pushing us to write more and more letters, which we all did. So I wanted to meet Mitchie, and I went down there, and I came home on Monday. Tuesday, NCRR from Los Angeles called and asked me to come down for a press conference. And I told them I could not because JCL had told me that at the meeting they had in Washington, D.C., it looked like it was only going to be for railroad workers and not railroad families. And I says, you know, I have spent so much time off of my job going to different places for the reparations that I can't take any more time off. And I had grades due on Friday, and I just couldn't make Friday night in Los Angeles. Well, they kept calling and calling, and she says, well, Fumie, if it's for the families, will you come? And I says, if it's for the families, I'm going to have to think hard about it because my grades have to be turned in on Friday. So she called me back, and we're both trying to reach ORA, and she finally got a hold of him. And she asked Joanne Chieti, is this news going to make me happy? She says, yes, she'll be happy. Will it make me very, very, very happy? And she says, yes, it will make you very, very, very happy. So she says, Fumie, you've got to come. I think it's going to be for the families. And I says, oh, gosh. I said, I don't know how I'm going to do this. But I says, I have to get my lesson plans done for the substitute. I have to get my grades turned in. And I says, I don't think I'm going to make it. So I did my grades, and I had 19 errors when I got back because I was so rushed in making my grades that when we were to check them on Monday, I looked at it and I thought, oh my gosh, where was my mind? I made so many mistakes turning in the grades. So I made all the corrections, and Sam and I did drive down to Los Angeles. We left Friday morning because the interview was supposed to be with Bill Lanley was supposed to be at 5 o'clock. When we got there, they told me, you know, Bill Lanley said he didn't want any press there, but he wanted the meeting with top administrators and everybody who was involved. So we were there, and she says, we didn't call the press, we didn't call the TV stations or anything because he does not want a press conference. So we said, okay, he's just going to come in and talk to us and give us the results. So he came in and he talked about his daughter for a while and his family. And he says, okay, let's sit down and have the meeting. So we were having the meeting. And he opens up and he says, I decided with the approval of the attorneys, if all the attorneys did not agree with me, I would not make this decision. But he says all 10 attorneys in attendance agreed that the railroad workers would get reparations. So, and he says it will include family members. So we were all cheering, and my husband goes, wait a minute. He says, for 8.5 years, you've been turning us down. It was 10 years for everybody else. But I got on the wagon a 1.5 years later because I didn't know they were going to give reparations to railroad workers. And he says, for the last 10 years, we've been turned down. What made you change your mind in 10 days? And I thought, oh, I wish you'd just shut up and just appreciate the fact that we were getting it. So I was trying to kick him under the table, and it wasn't doing me any good. So we discussed it for a while, and then he said, open the doors and let the press in. And our mouths just gaped open. And he had called the press on whoever he wanted to be in attendance. And Kay had said, oh, wow, if you had told me, we could have gotten some TV stations there too. But he made his own decision on who was going to be at the press conference. So he goes to the podium with about 10 typed pages, and the rest of us moved to the back of the room in different places so the press could come in. And he was reading his decision to the press at the time. And all of a sudden, my husband jumped up for something Bill had said, grabbed me, hugged me, and kissed me, which he never shows affection in public. So I'm kind of shocked. Well, a newspaper reporter saw this action happening in the back of the room. So he comes over and he starts taking all kinds of pictures of us. And I'm kind of laughing to myself, thinking if he only knew how much film he was wasting. And then because he was taking so many pictures, this newspaper from Japan came over and started taking pictures of us. And Bill saw all this action going on in the back of the room. So as he finished his speech with 10 pages of written material, he said, we have a railroad family in the audience, and she's going to come up and give her press conference. And I could not believe he did this to me with no warning. I had not been told that I was going to go up. So I just sat there, and my husband says, you better go. I says, I'm not going up there. I don't have anything prepared to talk about. And he says, he's waiting for you. You better go. They're all waiting. So finally I got up and I thought, okay, I'll go up and I'll thank everybody who helped me on this journey to where we were. So I got up there, and he says, I'm going to stand right next to you. And I says, fine. He says, no. He says, I'm going to kiss you. So he gave me a kiss on the cheek. And we're standing there, and I thanked everybody who had helped me on this trip for reparations. And Sam was so worried. He says, Fumie, that was the worst thing you could do, because if you left out a name, it would offend somebody. And he says, I was so worried. But he says, I was counting everybody that you were naming off. And he says, I think you got them all. And I says, I hope I did. So after I finished, I said, thank you, and I started to walk away. Oh, Bill said, that was very nice. And I said, thank you. And I started to walk away, and he grabbed my arm. He says, now I'll give your press conference. And I says, that was my press conference. He says, no, it wasn't. So all I remember saying was, my father, Kamataro Ishii. And I don't know what else I said. But I read the article the next day, and I told Sam, I don't remember saying this, but I must have, because it was things that did apply to me, and I probably would have said. But because I didn't have my wedding band on, my diamond had come loose, so the prongs were broken, so I had taken my rings off. They printed in the paper, her father, Kamataro Shimada. And I told Sam, I bet he's rolling over his grave now because of being called Kamataro Shimada. I says, the lady did not know that I was married, and she thought Fumie Shimada was my single name. But Bill and I became very good friends after this press conference, and he came down to some kind of honoring at Sac State, and we went to meet him there. And we were going through the buffet line, and he served me all the way through. And he came up and he nudged me in the side, and he says, you know, Fumie, I'm not afraid to make decisions, because I had made that comment at him. And everything I had said to Joanne, he was elbowing me and giving it back to me, you know, any way he could. But we've remained very good friends, and this trip as reparations has just been wonderful. I've met so many people. I've been to so many places. Andy Russell and I have done speeches together at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. We went to Mexico, University of New Mexico, and we had a program there. And Andy has visited me, and I visited him, and he comes down and stays with me very often. And it's just been a wonderful experience. you know, through a terrible tragedy. Our family went through a lot. We suffered a lot, but we didn't get discriminated during the war. Sparks is a very small town, and the people we associated were friends of my father. So we didn't get any name calling or any badgering. They didn't come to the house and vandalize us or steal from us or anything. They just left us alone. With the UNR radio station, and they did do an hour interview on me there, and I had my high school teachers call me. I had high school friends call in during the show, which I thought was very interesting. But this trail to reparations has really been wonderful. The Associated Press from Carson City called, and he wanted to do a story on me because the people from the library had told him that I was doing this search for reparations. So he did a story, Local Girl Makes Good, for the state of Nevada. His supervisor liked it so much she wanted him to take it nationwide. So he called me back, and we enhanced the story a little bit more and made it larger, and he sent it out on the United States website, and different newspapers printed the articles, and he won a newspaper award from the Associated Press, a national award for the most interesting human story. So I thought that was wonderful. Kenji Taguma also won an award for Foreign Newspapers Award because of my story. And so two people who had supported me all the way won their national acclaim with their story writing. And it's just been such a fabulous thing. People said they didn't know railroad workers had been fired, but to be able to go back the day after the war. Another interesting thing, my uncle was interned in Tule Lake, and evidently he was sick, so he sent my mother down to visit him. So my two brothers drove the old Model A, and my sister and I were forced to go with them because Dad went to work and we wouldn't have a babysitter. So we went to Tule Lake. They stopped us on the way because we were traveling outside of our 5-mile radius, but we had a permission slip to travel. So we got to Tule Lake, and we were outside of the guard station, and they took my two brothers and my mother. This armed guard took them inside. We were told to stay inside the car. My sister and I were sitting on the bumper, and we were crying because we saw these armed men taking my two brothers and my mother away, and we thought they were going to be shot. So we just cried and cried and cried, and my mother came out and scolded us. I guess they had to take pictures and everything for security reasons before they could let us into the camp. So we went into the camp, and we spent a couple days there visiting my aunt and uncle. So I did see a little bit of Tule Lake in action at the time. Before we left, my uncle said, "Your tires are in terrible shape." He says, "You cannot make it back to Nevada with those 4 tires. And Mom says, "Well, you know, there's a war going on. Tires are being rationed." She says, "I don't have the money to buy 4 new tires." She says, "What am I going to do?" And he says, "Just go to sleep and don't worry about it." So we went to bed, and the next morning we were getting ready. We were loading up the car, and we had 4 different tires on the car. And we don't know. He says, "Don't ask any questions, just leave." So we just left, and Dad says, "I know where he got those tires." And I think we all know, because none of the internees could have cars. The only cars there were naturally the military Jeeps. And he got away with another one. We asked to be interned because my father was fired. We owned our home because in Nevada you could buy property, or in California you couldn't. But without a job, we wouldn't be able to survive. We couldn't put food on the table. We had a roof over our head, but we didn't have the money to pay our taxes and this type of thing. So we asked to be interned, and they refused us. So we were rejects on that basis. And that's how we were forced to survive. My mother was selling eggs from the chickens. My brother was selling rabbits. My other brother went to work for one of the grocery stores, and my sister went to work as a hairdresser after school every night. So Dad did whatever he could later to scavenge around for jobs, and he did odd jobs all over, and somehow, with the Lord's blessing, we made it. And Dad got hired back, so it's been an interesting trip. We live poor, but Mom and Dad used to raise a garden, and they had fruit trees. Mom used to can, and she used to freeze. Dad was a hunter, but during the war, he had to give up all his rifles and binoculars and hunting gear, and we couldn't go fishing anymore. So we were limited on what he could provide for us in that respect. But after the war, we got back our rifles and binoculars and hunting equipment. So Dad continued hunting and fishing, and we made it. We didn't go hungry, so I have to give my parents a lot of credit to support 5 children with no real income to fall back on. A lot of the railroad workers did not get redress because they said they didn't move. And I called Dee Dee Green and I asked her why, because I didn't move either. We had our own house. A lot of the section workers had to move because they were living in the section homes, and they were told they had to be out by a certain time. So a lot of them moved away to Utah and different areas. But there's been a lot of railroad workers who did not get redress. And I've questioned it, they've questioned it. There's no pat answers. Of course, the sunset has closed, and we were hoping that we could get more money under the redress plan to try to get redress for everybody, but it didn't happen, and I'm kind of disappointed. I've asked for how many people did get redress, and ORA has never given me an answer. But I know the redress for railroad worker and mine workers had to be close to $4 million. So that was $20,000 for every member of the family who was alive in 1988, 89 when the redress bill passed. A lot of people had passed away. My mother and father did not get redress, and they're the ones who really suffered, not the children. But my uncle survived, but he got redress because he was interned, and he could not get redress for railroad. You can only get one redress per person. But the railroad family has become a close-knit group. When Patty Wada from National JCL wanted a meeting with all the railroad families, and we all met in San Francisco as she was trying to help us with our redress papers. She brought in an attorney who told us at the time, you're not going to get it as railroad workers, so try to find a way through the back door to get redress. And Mr. Ogasawara, who was a professor at UC Davis, was furious. He says, we are not going through any back door. We either get redress as railroad workers or we don't get redress. He says, we're not going to try to go through the back door. So thankfully, with Patty's help, everybody in the room happened to be from Nevada. It was interesting. Some of them were mine workers, some of them were railroad workers, but the people who lived in California got redress because they were interned. But the people in Nevada did not get redress, and we were not considered living on the West Coast. So the people that she had in the room were all from Nevada. I remember one man stood up and he said, he looked at me and he says, you say you're from Nevada? And I said, yes, I am. And he says, well, do you know where Carlin, Nevada is? And I says, yes. I says, it's right next door to Elko, Nevada. And he says, yeah, I guess you are from Nevada, aren't you? So I met a lot of people. One lived in Caliente, and I turned to my friend and I said, Caliente, they hardly have any white people. How did they get Asians there? But I didn't realize they had mines there. And I didn't even know the Japanese worked in the mines. But we knew the Chinese story about building the railroad tracks across Donner Summit, but no one knew about the Japanese who were fired. So it was a good ride for all of us. Well, you know, we didn't have too much discrimination. We did have the taxi cab driver. We had different people helping the family out, but I think it's a small town scene. You know, like even in Elk Grove, Mariel had a family come through and help her with the family farm and maintain the farm for the family so they could come back and continue their lives. I think Sparks being very, very small, and it's a railroad town, and they all worked with my dad, and they knew my dad. 5 children. There were a lot of parents that went to school with, the children went to school with us, so they were all friendly too. In fact, Chet Christensen was an assemblyman for the state of Nevada, and his son was at my 50th high school reunion. And he just happened to say, "Hey, Fumie, I didn't know anything about internment, and I found out we have a camp in Utah." He says, "Can we talk about it sometime?" And I said, "Sure, Jim." And I hadn't seen Jim since high school, so it was 50 years since I had seen Jim. And I says, "In fact, we're going to Manzanar. Would you like to come with us?" And he says, "I think I would." He says, "Why don't you give me a call?" So from there, Jim and I reunited after 50 years, and he made, I think, 2 or 3 trips to Manzanar. And he came and he stayed with me during the time before and after, and we've just had such a wonderful life. I remember when he came up to talk to me, I said, "Oh my gosh, Jim, in 2nd grade you were the love of my life," and he turned beet red. But to meet him and his family, and he says, "You know, Fumie," he says, "I'm a Mormon, and my grandfather faced a lot of discrimination. They burnt his farm down twice because he was Mormon." He says, "I know what you've been through." But he says, "In school, I didn't realize you were going through all this." But he says that's why we ended up in Utah, because he was burned off his ranch in 2 other places. So we were saying, it's not just to the Japanese, but it happened to the entire population of Japanese, where it didn't happen to the entire population of Mormons. But Jim says, "I know what discrimination is because my family has lived with it." And he says, I took this girl from our class to the junior prom, and my mother was upset because she was Italian. He says, "I didn't realize my mother was like that." And I says, "Well, a lot of people are, I remember we had a parent conference in Bright Elementary over a girl who was having a hard time getting along with mixed races. And the mother says, "Well," she says, "we're not prejudiced at all." She says, "We even have an Italian in our family." So we kind of laughed about that after the parent conference. But there's discrimination going on. And I think we all try to live without it and try to bring everybody together. But will we ever get rid of discrimination and hate and violence? I don't think so. The Sikh people, the Muslims are going through it today, just as the Japanese did. They started facing it after 9/11, and our Florence JCL has been working with the community in Sacramento and Elk Grove and sharing our stories. And they said, "You were interned, we're interned within ourselves here because of all the prejudice." But he says, Andy Noguchi has stepped forward and opened the doors for us. And he says, "We can talk to you because you've lived it, and we need your experience to guide our lives." So we've become very close with the Muslims and the Sikhs in our chapter. They go to Manzanar with us. They share the experience. I think on the bus ride, we all get on the bus and we tell our stories, because if we don't tell our stories, no one will ever know. And I remember, I don't know if you've heard about the Peruvians, the Japanese Peruvians, who were, one girl came to one of the time of remembrances, and she heard about what happened to the Peruvians. So she went home and she told her mother, "Gee, did you know this happened?" She says, "They were telling us about how the Peruvians were kidnapped and brought to the United States and blah, 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 blah." She was a junior in college. And her mother said, "I think we need to sit down and talk. We were one of those families." And she says, "My grandparents and my parents never talked about it." She says, "If I hadn't gone to that time of remembrance, I would have never known this happened in my family and how we ended up in the United States." So I think we have not spoken about it. My family didn't really talk about it. Mom would say because of the hardship when Dad lost his job, but she would never say why he lost his job. And the day the war ended, I have a picture of my uncle and 2 other Japanese men that the SP came back to Tule Lake, and they asked the railroad workers if they would come back to work after they returned from camp. And my uncle did return, and I have that one picture. And I says, he showed it to me after I came home from Washington, and I says, Uncle Tom, if you had given me this, I would have taken it with me, because this would have really been, you know, something outstanding. Because we got a letter from Southern Pacific when they asked us to get the letter, and they said, the Southern Pacific did not fire the workers. We do not discriminate against our workers. And ORA would not accept it because it was written 50 years after the fact. They wanted something that was written at that time. And this is where Andy Russell's paper helped us, because he had letters from the attorney of the mine workers to the president of the mine workers. And after the reparations came out and I was interviewed, the president of the mines was still alive. And he wrote Andy Russell and asked him for a copy of all the letters that he had on file, because he went to the Ely Museum and he couldn't find them. And he wanted to write a book about it because I had spoken about it so much. So they told us at the time that he was writing a book. Whatever happened, I don't know. I've got to follow through with that. So I went back, and Sam and I went to the Ely Museum to try to find the original letter, and they couldn't find it. So if Andy hadn't done his master's thesis, we would have never had, you know, the smoking gun to get our redress with. So I have to give credit to Andy Russell for helping us. And ORA did call him and interviewed him to find out how he felt about who was responsible. And he said most other railroads were fired by the FBI, but there are a few. Union Pacific was the only one that I know of that fired before that. But they had to get permission from the federal government to fire, because they said, if you fire them, we have to keep track of where they go. We don't want them to just scatter. So you can fire them, but let's keep a pattern of where they go so we can follow. And that was the only one. But because the railroad is national transportation, it's governed by the United States government. And this is why the FBI was running all over the state of Nevada, and they were confiscating. My dad had a shortwave radio, and during the war, since he didn't read English, he could only speak Japanese or read Japanese, he took it out of the radio because we weren't allowed to have the shortwave, and he hid it. And every night he would bring it back and he'd put it back in the radio, and he listened to the shortwave news from Japan because it was speaking Japanese. And then after the program was over, he would hide it again and he'd bring it out the next night. And my sister says, I remember somebody taking the shortwave radio out. And I says, I do too, and I remember him putting it back in every night. But he did hang on to that. But some of the guns and material he did hand over to a neighbor to keep for him for safekeeping. Some of the other items he left with other railroad workers for safekeeping, and some things he did have to turn in to the police department, which returned it after the war for safekeeping. But we weren't allowed to have our binoculars, shotguns, hunting rifles, or anything during that time. But people were very good to us at the time, being a small community. And I think it's the fact that everybody knew us. And I remember growing up, my dad was always telling me, don't you ever do anything wrong, because everybody knows who you belong to, and I don't want to have to listen to it. He says, anybody else can do it, but no one knows who their parents are. But everybody knows who your parents are. And we were the only Japanese family until the war, when a few of them moved in from California because they didn't want to be interned. So they came and lived in Nevada. But it's a great place. I can remember my sister being very angry because she was 5 years older than I was. So she says, how do you remember all this when you were only 3 and I was 8 and I don't know those things? But I think it had to do with the fact that my they were all in school during the day, and I wasn't able to go to school. So my parents dragged me around to every place they went, and they would be talking, and I would hear this conversation. So I think I remember more because I was raised with it, where they didn't, you know. And I remember during the war, the school nurse made arrangements for my sister to get free cafeteria food. And my mother said that was such a big help. She says she can't, she can't thank the school nurse enough for doing that for the kids. And so when I see free lunch at school, I don't think anything about it. It's a normal, thing that the kids should have because they shouldn't have to starve. So, and I think it introduced us to, most of our diet was Asian. But my mother was taught how to bake pies. She made a 12-egg white angel food cake. She knew how to can. She made her own ketchup. We had homemade pickle relish, which tastes just like Del Monte's pickle relish, And I think all the wives came over and helped her adapt to the United States and help her with her cooking and preservation and how to freeze and how to can food. And they taught my mother so much, and she has all her pumpkin pie recipes, and she made her apple pies, and we had eggs, abundance of eggs, so she made a 12-egg white angel food cake, and she was ahead of her time, the time. I remember her wearing shorts. And if you don't hear too many Issei ladies who wore shorts and pants back in those days. Everybody else wore white gloves and heels and hats, But my mother really Americanized herself to that state. They did get their citizenship after 52 or 53 or whenever the act was passed. I think my dad got it with the second group of people who got their citizenship. And I think my mother took another year before she got her citizenship.